بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. سعيدين جدا إنه نلتقيكم اليوم في هذا اللقاء مع السيد كامرون هاتسون. This interview will be in English and after we finish the recording of the interview we will try our best with all the volunteers to translate it into Arabic so many people can benefit from it. But the interview will be conducted in English. Because of the time we have, and also because several volunteers have volunteered to translate it into Arabic. This is part of our long-standing series of big interviews. And today we're going to be discussing quite an important topic, which is the future of the new Sudan. And the reason for the new Sudan, because Sudan, as you all have followed, has been going through a real transformation over the last 3 years after the revolution. Our guest today is Cameron Hudson. Cameron is a well-known, how do I call it, an American, a Western individual with tremendous wealth of experience, not just about Sudan, but worldwide. He worked as a State Department in the US. He has an experience with many countries, not just Sudan, Iraq, other countries, and he has a good experience with countries in such a transformation process. But most specifically to Sudan, he has been involved in the Sudanese geopolitics for a long time, even from his own perspective as being the chief of staff in the past for the special envoy to the Sudan from the State Department in the United States. I have seen in the last, 4 or 5 months, even the Sudanese people have become so close to Cameron to the extent, I'm not sure if you know that, Cameron, then people doing hashtag with your name all the time. So he became a very popular name, really, to the Sudanese revolutions, from all sides, really. And I have never seen someone with that tremendous, if you like, likability from the Sudanese in such a very difficult time. And he stood by them. He's always there. He always commenting. Yes, he's English, but I think he started even to learn Arabic. Now, because of the time, and we are very keen to get as much as possible question and learning from his tremendous experience about Sudan, we will ask him specific 3 questions. We managed to collect all your questions. There are 3 or 4 questions. I think we will just stick to them from what we have gathered so far. But at the same time, we're going to give opportunities for those in the Zoom with us now. And also, we're going to give opportunities to 2 to 3 questions from the Facebook Live. We have our volunteers now. They will be looking at all the comments and the questions in the Facebook. We are streaming live in Sudan Knowledge Facebook and other social media. So make sure we will take your question and we will answer them. Now, I'm going to start with Cameron. First of all, thank you very much, Cameron, for giving us this opportunity. I think this is in my opinion, I think to get the opportunity to listen to someone like your experience about the geopolitics of Sudan is very important. Now, Cameron, I think you may have heard there was this question being coming on every day. I have watched you in many of the TV channels, but let us ask you the question again. Sudan is at a crossroad. It's even much more complicated crossroad now than before the revolution 3 years ago. Many people, they don't know really what is going on in Sudan, particularly the diaspora outside, like myself and others who are outside. What do you think is going to happen, or what is next in Sudan? From your analysis, from your engagement, from your long-standing with the Sudanese geopolitics, from the perspective of the American government, because you have the experience of the state government there. What do you think is happening next in Sudan?
Well, Professor Alam, thank you very much for having me on and allowing me the opportunity to talk about these subjects. And thanks for all of the viewers that tune in and are paying attention to this issue. In response to your question, obviously, I don't have a crystal ball about what is going to happen. But let me say a few things about where I think the Sudanese people are. And I say that with great humility because I'm not Sudanese. And it has been too long since I've been in Sudan. Obviously, I'm speaking to my Sudanese friends and colleagues every day, trying to stay on top of what's happening, obviously watching on social media what's happening. So I have a sense, but I haven't haven't walked the streets of Khartoum for quite a long time now because of COVID. But then I can also just comment briefly, I think, on where the United States policy is currently, where it's going, but also give you some sense of the history of where I think our policy has been before. So, first, with respect to the state of the revolution, I have to say that the longer this goes on, the stronger I think it becomes. I think that one thing that I have been counseling people in the US government and in other governments is we should not rush in the international community to force a process, a narrow political process on this movement. The resistance committees, the kind of the revolutionary spirit, it needs oxygen to survive. And that oxygen is in the streets. It's not in a conference room. And so as much as I think there is a desire within the international community to create order where they see chaos, to create structure, to create process where they see disorder and no process, I think that's a mistake. I think that what we need to be doing is giving these grassroots movements the time and the space to grow, to mature, to organize, to develop a common platform, to create coherence, to create unity across this vast spectrum of regions, of careers, of socioeconomic backgrounds, of ethnic and religious backgrounds. That is the strength of this revolution, is its diversity. And we have to make sure that, because the military has a history, of course, of using Sudan's diversity to its own advantage, using that diversity and creating fissures within society to keep society divided and weak. And so unity is what frightens them the most. And I think that unity will come from from the time and space and the protests that are having the success that they're having right now. And so I think that anything that we do to try to fit this process or to fit this movement into a process is going to hurt it. The second thing is, I think the longer that the military feels this pressure, the longer that the various factions of the military and the security forces generally are feeling this pressure, I think the more weak they become. I think we are already starting to see signs. We've seen statements in the last week or two from various generals across the security services suggesting that maybe there are some divisions, but within the SAF, between the SAF and the RSF, between some of these figures. They are feeling the pressure. They will feel less pressure in a conference room, in a process. They feel very comfortable. I have sat across from Sudan's military in Naivasha, in Machakos, in Abuja, in Khartoum, in Rome. They are very comfortable engaging in a political process that they are then able to undermine. And I keep trying to remind people, when the military signed the CPA, for example, and the NCP signed the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, that was not a strategic defeat of the NCP and the SAF. That was a tactical retreat. They did not fundamentally alter their makeup or their DNA or their approach to governance by signing that peace agreement. That peace agreement allowed them to survive. It allowed them the time and the space to come back even stronger. And I think we have to remember that when they signed the Darfur Peace Agreement, when they signed the Juba Peace Agreement, when they engage in these processes, and it doesn't matter what amount of international support and leverage is brought to those processes, they see an ability to undermine that process over the medium term. And so I think we have to remember that history, because the military has used it to its advantage. When you look back at all of the various peace processes, right? All of the various political dialogues, all of the national dialogues that Sudan has had in the last 30 years, right? The one common element of all of those processes is that at the end of all of those processes, the military came out strengthened. And so why should we expect today anything else to happen? And that's why I remain fearful of the UN led process right now. I have questions about the UN led process, not because I doubt the sincerity of the special representative, not because I doubt the sincerity of the UN Security Council. It's fundamentally because I doubt the sincerity of the military and the generals. And they have demonstrated time and time and time again that they do not deserve our trust. And they have shown time and again that they are very savvy and sophisticated at using these processes to regain strength and to come back stronger. And so that's my fear. And so that's, I do think that the longer this protest movement can continue, the more support that international audiences can give to the protesters to help them organize themselves, to stay coordinated, to stay unified. I think the stronger they will be. And I think the weaker the military will be. I think over time, this tension and this pressure and this sort of seemingly chaotic environment will have more of a detrimental effect on the military. That's number one. Number two, where the United States and where the international community is, I think is very important right now. And I think, I'm in Washington, and so I can, my expertise is really about how my own government is responding to these questions. I would argue that Washington is as little engaged now as it has been in the past 20 years. I think that the people that we have in authority right now in Washington, in the State Department of the White House, they do not have a sense of the unique U.S. role in shaping the past 20 years, 30 years of history in Sudan. We have had, I think, 8 special envoys to Sudan going back to 2001. We have had, and those were presidential envoys. The envoy that we have right now to the Horn of Africa is not a presidential envoy. He's not even an envoy to Sudan. He's to the whole region, right? And we know that at least half or more of his time is being spent on Ethiopia right now. So we have downgraded our level of engagement. We have downgraded the amount of engagement, and yet we are hoping for this kind of transformational outcome. We are hoping for truly a transformation of the Sudanese state into a civilian-led democratic government. And yet we are contributing fewer resources. Yes, we talk a lot about the $700 million that has been promised. But let's remember that $700 million was largely tied to Israeli recognition and the signing of the Abraham Accords. Most of that money was not going to state transformation. It was going to the family support plan. And frankly, most of it wasn't even programmed. It had not even been allocated, right? And so when you think about all of the hundreds of millions of dollars that the United States has continued to spend, the $700 million is very consistent with the money that has been spent by the United States on development assistance over time in Sudan. So I do think that we don't have a good enough sense of how much leverage, how much influence, how much history we have, and how much, frankly, responsibility the United States has in helping to ensure that this transition stays on track and that it continues. I have been very dismayed and disappointed by the reactions of my government in endorsing the November 24th agreement between the prime minister and the generals, and frankly, in response even to the launch of the UN process, which at the time did not seem to be fully benefiting from the support of the Sudanese people when it was launched. I think that Washington is adopting this process of what I would call lead from behind. They're letting others in the international community lead, the UN, the AU, others. But I think that they do that without a real appreciation for the unique role, history, and responsibility that the United States has in helping to determine an outcome that will be beneficial for the Sudanese people. I think we have misunderstood the power of the street. That's not uncommon for diplomats. Diplomats are used to dealing with other diplomats or government officials. That's how they're trained. That's how they, that's how they carry out their duties. And so I think there has been some missteps and some slowness in really understanding how to engage resistance committees and pro-democracy groups. But I think the bottom line is we cannot think that we are going to achieve the kind of change in Sudan and that the Sudanese are going to achieve the kind of change that we say we support unless we invest more of our diplomatic time and energy into this project. And so while I am very much encouraged about the strength of the protest movement, about the will of the Sudanese people, they accurately recognize that this is a once in a lifetime, a once in a generation opportunity to change the fundamental nature of the state. And they're not going home. They are seizing this opportunity. And I think that Washington has fundamentally, discounted the power of this moment, and we need to catch up. We need to engage with the streets more, and we need to demonstrate that we have a sense of our own history and we're making the investments that are necessary to make this successful.
Cameron, thank you very, very much. That's a very, very good introduction, but the questions are just boring on. Now, Cameron, let me start with the last one you just mentioned about the protesters. I'm sure you may have followed what has happened over the last, a week or so from the State Department, this announcement of the 700 million, including the 100 million, which I know you are very active in the tweet, the social media, but in the Arabic one, which probably wasn't easy for you to understand, there is lots of accusation. This 100 million is being given to the protesters, which is legally how a government will intervene in a situation like this. But it's followed a series of accusation, I will just call them accusation, for a long time about the intervention of the United States in Sudan in particular. Some people still think in their mind the US was behind the separation of South Sudan. Some people now are even promoting the idea the US is keen on separating more parts of Sudan. I know you are not here representing the State Department to explain, but your analysis is always very good. I have read you many times. So these things are combining, keep coming. That means it will make it difficult for anyone we all wanted to get a positive outcome of this revolution. But the key player really, let's put it this way, is the United States. The United Kingdom is not as key as in the US. Germany, France, all key OECD countries are not really significant on the street of Sudan like the US. Also, I don't want to prolong the question, but there's many analysts and people or journalists keep analyzing the role of the US across the whole world, which I know we don't want to go to all of them, but generally they said the US intervention in many countries like Syria, for example, a little bit, but Iraq, Afghanistan story. I know they're all different stories. The US was there for different purposes, but the US does not really have a good track record of really helping countries transforming themselves in the way they want. And that's the question is being on the street of Khartoum. If you read the Arabic newspaper, America wants to transform, or they want us to come like this. We want to be like this. So how do you respond to this? I know it's a big story, but I don't want to put it in a way, many people, they don't trust the United States, but it's a key player in Sudan now. Do you think that's a justifiable feeling about trust on the United States goodwill to us as the Sudanese, or do you think it's not founded, or do you think it's just being promoted by other people who they really want to stop this revolution from bringing results? Just unmute yourself, Cameron. I'm not sure why you are. Can you unmute yourself?
Now I can. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Listen, I think that in answer to your question, yes, I think Washington. I was saying before, I don't think that Washington is very good at transforming countries and transitioning them to democratic states. We have a very mixed track record of trying to engineer, from Washington, 7,000 miles away, a democratic outcome in a country. I think, ironically, one of the things that made the 2019 revolution so strong is the fact that it was Sudanese led. There wasn't a lot of intervention from Washington. There wasn't foreign intervention. The military and Bashir weren't able to say, these protesters, they're just tools of the West. That was not an argument that you heard, because frankly, the support that Washington was providing was in fact very minimal. And so in some ways, it benefited the revolution to not have a very heavy approach from Washington. I think where you see Washington getting involved was in the deal that brought about this political marriage between the civilians and the military. Right? You'll remember that there was a late night deal that was cooked up between diplomats and the military and civilians. Now, I think that was done with the best of intentions. There was great fear at the time. This is, again, in the month after the June 3rd massacre and the clearing of the protesters. There was great fear that there were going to be more massacres, that massacre of June 3rd was only the first of many to come, and that the military was changing tactics, and we were going to see this turn into a much more bloody revolution than we had seen up to that point. And there was real fear, I think, from Washington and from the international community that we needed to intervene to avoid bloodshed. And what resulted from that is this political accommodation between military and civilians, this system that for the last 2+ years was, kind of governing Sudan. I think that is why Washington was so quick to endorse the November 21st deal, because it returned to that political arrangement that we had endorsed. But that political arrangement, I think, ultimately, when you look back on it in retrospect, that was a political deal intended to avoid a short-term consequence. It was intended to de-escalate the situation and to avoid a worst-case scenario of bloodshed of the protest movement. But it was not strong enough to last more than 2 years in helping to be a governing framework for the country. And I think that oftentimes Washington has a strategic vision. So they might say, we want to see Sudan become civilian-led and democratic. But all of those smaller decisions along the way, those tactical choices that we make, they in fact reinforce the status quo. They constantly return to the status quo. And I think that's why you have seen this resistance to the November 21st agreement. That's why you've seen the resignation of the prime minister, is because it was very clear from the civilian protesters that a return to the status quo just wasn't going to suffice. It was no longer going to be sufficient. People had lost their patience. People had lost their trust. And I think that, again, Washington is not good at defining a strategic objective like the transformation of the Sudanese state, and then over the span of 2 or 3 or 4 years, staying committed to a strategy which achieves that strategic objective. Let's be very clear. If you listen to the Senate testimony that took place in Washington earlier this week, the 1st of February, you will hear that we do not actually have a strategic document for how we are going to achieve this objective of democracy and civilian rule in Sudan. I don't know of another country or another issue where we define a strategic objective, a long-term strategic objective, and then don't develop any kind of plan whatsoever for how we're going to achieve it. I think that the strategic plan that we have had was to rely on Prime Minister Hamdok to help us achieve it, right? That's not a strategy. That's a hope, right? And so you see time and time again, Washington becoming committed not to a strategy or a plan, but to a person, to an individual. And the problem is, of course, when that individual loses credibility, when that individual loses the backing of the people, then where does the U.S. policy, stand? And so, as of course we have seen, in Sudan in the last 2 months, with the downfall of Prime Minister Hamdok, Washington is now scrambling to figure out, well, what do we do now? How do we stay on track to achieving this strategic objective? And of course, they grab the first partner that they see, who's Volker Perthes, right? The prime minister, exits the scene, and the UN special representative enters the scene, and Washington jumps from one partner to the next, and now we're saying, well, we're going to ride this horse, across the finish line. And so again, what you have is a series of reactionary ad hoc decisions that are trying to advance a strategic objective. And I think that if we were in a business environment, if we were in a managerial environment, we would never say that that's a good approach. We would never say that it makes sense to not have a plan for achieving a strategic objective. And I think that is the problem that we face in Washington, is we have high hopes, we have great aspirations. We talk about those great aspirations in speeches from high-level officials. But when we go to implement and decide how we're going to achieve that, we end up reacting to events on the ground in ways that knocks us off of our strategic approach. And that's the problem. And frankly, the military knows that. The military, I keep saying to people, the military is an arsonist and the firefighter. They create the problem and offer themselves up as the solution to the problem. And Washington continues to, that is why Washington continues to believe that the military remains essential to the political process in Sudan. You heard the Assistant Secretary this week say repeatedly, going back to the 2019 Constitutional Declaration, going back to the Juba Peace Accord, we are committed to a political process. Washington is committed to a political process that ensures that the military is, in her own words, a participant in this process. And I think that my sense of the Sudanese street is that they no longer believe that the military has a legitimate claim to participate in governing the country. And I think that is the fundamental flaw that Washington faces right now. Not only that we are out of touch with the street, but that we don't have a plan that we can stay true to. And so when a crisis develops of the military's own making, we end up responding to that crisis, and that diverts us from our ultimate objective, which we should be asking ourselves every day, which is, does this decision that we are making today, does it achieve in the long term civilian rule and democracy? And if the answer to that any day is no, then we shouldn't take that decision.
Okay, thank you, Cameron. I'm just going to, anyone would like to ask a question? I'm going to open it now. Just raise your hand. But there's a question. I'm going to pick this question already from the chat to start with. Can you tell us, what do you think? Someone asked you straightforward, what do you think of the Juba Peace Agreement? But let me just put that in another one. You talked, you raised your concern about the UN. Many people raise their concern about the UN. They don't think it's going to end up in any positive outcome. One, for example, I have seen this, I can't remember, in one of the tweets or something, there's a picture of the UN Volker with all the political parties. And he said, all those on the table with Volker, if they go outside the UN building, they cannot walk the street because there are lots of disconnection between them and the protesters. So there's no hope in the military. No one disagree with you. There is another player, the UN, not only you, many people raise their concern, it's not going anywhere. The other problem, and also if you can also talk about it, to what extent do you see the political system or our political parties are part of what we are here now? Because all of them are claiming this is all to do with the military, not to do with us. But the ordinary Sudanese, inside and outside Sudan, they say they have a role to play in what happened over the last 2 years. And also, if you can bring that on board with you, the Juba Peace Agreement, because now that we have a new force, a big player now. This peace agreement brought those 4 or 5, if you like, I don't want to call them military groups, but those are Sudanese. They are fighting for lots of issues which we all agree with. We all wanted the best and the very best for our people in Darfur. But the reality on the ground now, this is a new player. They are part of the big umbrella now. If you can take this one maybe as quick as you can, because I can see people start asking. I know it's a big question, but where can you fit all this one? The political parties, UN, we all agree with you. Political parties are, I'm not saying that they are struggling now on the street, even to get someone to listen to them. And then you have the Juba Peace Agreement. What do you think of?
Okay, so I'll take the Juba Peace Agreement first.
Okay.
So listen, I was initially skeptical of the Juba Peace Agreement because of the process by which it was negotiated, because it was largely led by the military. So I had my skepticism, but at the same time, I think those of us in the international community want to encourage Sudanese to resolve Sudanese problems, right? To have an indigenous process, a Sudanese owned and led process. So there was an effort, I think, early on to try to support that. I think in retrospect, the Juba Peace Agreement is a Trojan horse designed by the military. It brought into Khartoum, where the military had no political allies, it brought in and created political allies among the armed movements, among the GEM, among Mini Manawi. It brought in political allies into Khartoum for the military that they did not have before. And they used that Trojan horse to take over the cabinet, to take over key positions of the economy, to take over, the mining sectors. They used their allies among the armed movements to infiltrate civilian government and to use that to further entrench themselves. And so I think that at the end of the day, when you look at who signed the Juba Peace Accord, it was the weakest armed movements. It was the armed movements with the fewest troops on the ground. And so I do think that the military was very smart in how they negotiated that in Juba, away from Western eyes, how it had very little input from women's groups, youth groups, resistance committees, all of the groups who are leading this kind of revolutionary change right now. It had very little input from them. This is a deal among elites and among guys with guns, all of whom, we have an expression here in English that there is honor among thieves. And so these are all thieves who are signatories to the Juba Peace Accord, and they are taking care of themselves in this agreement. And so when we talk about going back to the Juba Peace Agreement, listen, I'm all for resolving the conflicts on Sudan's periphery. I understand well the history of Sudan and the history of subjugation of the peripheral regions of Sudan, but this is not the way to solve it. This was a military tactic to create political allies and to entrench themselves further and take further control over what we called civilian-led government, but which was in fact hollowed out and infiltrated by the military. With respect to UNITAMs, listen, I'm very sympathetic to the fact that the UN is struggling with its own credibility in Sudan because it quickly endorsed this political deal with the military and the prime minister, because it did not condemn strongly enough the coup that took place. And so I think that they have done themselves a disservice. There's no question about that. The other part of this, however, is that this is a process that has been endorsed by the UN Security Council, by the international community. When I talk to US diplomats, what they will tell me, or what I talk to European diplomats, what they will tell me is, we're very worried about the role of outside actors. We're very worried about the role of the Emirates, the role of the Saudi Arabias, the role of Turkey, the role of Egypt. And so things like the Friends Committee on Sudan, things like this UNITAMS-led political process, what they say is it creates transparency. It creates transparency in the dialogue so that we are all sharing the same information. We are all understanding the same challenges that are out there. It's a big tent approach is what they will say. And in order to create a big tent approach to keep everybody in, you have to create compromise. Right now, this process is the only game in town. It is the only process that exists for creating dialogue, both among the groups in Sudan and between these groups and the military. And so my concern is obviously that a process like this is ideally suited for the military, because as I said before, whether it's been the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, the Darfur Peace Agreement, the military has an ability to manipulate the outcomes of these agreements in a way that benefits them. And so I think we in the international community and you on the Sudanese participant side have to go into this process, as we say, with our eyes wide open, understanding that the military is intending to manipulate this process for their own benefit. And if we can go into this process recognizing that, then I think it will make us cautious, it will make us skeptical, and will hopefully improve the content of this process. But I think at the end of the day, I'm convinced by the people who would tell me this is the only process in town. It has been endorsed by the highest authorities in the world, the UN Security Council. And so we need to engage and give it the benefit of the doubt until it demonstrates that it has not worked, until it has demonstrated that it's a failure. Until that time, I think there is a need to engage in it. And I think that's what you've heard from Washington, is to say, we're going to invest everything we can into making sure that this process is inclusive and transparent. I think we have to go in with a healthy amount of skepticism, but at the same time, it is the only process in town right now. And so I think we should do everything we can to make it work. On the last point, on the political parties, because I think this is a very important point, and it's something that I hear a lot. It's something that the military says a lot. My response to the argument that the political parties are the problem, they're not unified, they're out for themselves, they're self-interested, all of these arguments. My response is, show me a country in the world where the political parties are unified. Show me a country in the world where there is consensus among all of these different groups. Let's be a little bit sympathetic to the situation of Sudanese political parties. The parties that have existed for decades are today the product of 30 years of military rule, where the government has kept them under its thumb. It's tried to weaken them. It's tried to divide them. It's tried to antagonize the parties and pit one party against the other. So the military has manipulated the political space in Sudan for 3 decades. So if you see these groups not able to cooperate now, there's a reason for that. It's not because of their own making. I think it is honestly because the Sudanese political environment has been a kind of winner-take-all environment. It is not one that has been based upon compromise. I think the other thing, when you look at those criticisms, it is, in my mind, a demonstration of the fact that the military actually doesn't know what democracy looks like. Military doesn't know what multi-party democratic rule looks like, because if they did know what it looks like, they would know that what's happening in Sudan is what multi-party democracy looks like. Yes, politicians in America, in England, in Norway, I don't care. They are self-interested. That's what makes them politicians. They have to be elected. And so I think that we cannot fault that system. We cannot make the politicians out to be the problem. As I reminded a group of American diplomats the other day, let's remember who's killing people in Sudan. The politicians, the political parties are not carrying guns, shooting people in the street, shooting 70 or 80 unarmed protesters in the street. For as much as we might want to fault the political class for being disorganized or being self-interested, they're not killing people. And so let's remember, who the good guys are and who the bad guys are in this scenario. The military are the bad guys, and they're doing everything they can to try to make the politicians out to be the bad guys, when I don't care how bad that political class is, they're not killing anyone. They're not stealing state resources. They're not jailing people. They're not firing tear gas at people. So let's remember that. I think that obviously, when we talk about the US spending $100 million in democracy promotion, I think a lot of that needs to go to the political parties. Those parties, they need to be organized. They need youth wings to bring in new thinking. But let's remember also that kind of assistance, that kind of technical assistance for democratization and party building was prevented. The United States and other governments were prevented from providing that kind of assistance for 30 years under Bashir, because that's what he was afraid of. He was afraid that these political parties would gain strength, would gain popular momentum, and somehow create a revolution that unseated him. That's exactly what he was trying to prevent. And so Washington and London and other capitals are way behind where they should be in supporting these parties. The parties, just like the resistance committees, just because these parties have been around for 30 or 40 years, doesn't mean that they are any more organized or any more sophisticated than the resistance committees and the doctors' unions and other groups that we see protesting in the streets. They are organized differently. They have different needs. But the fact is that they are underdeveloped. They are less sophisticated than they need to be. They need to learn how to develop a grassroots movement. They need to learn how to bring youth into the party and appeal to broad segments, not just in Khartoum, but across the country. The military has kept this country divided for a very long time. So let's not be surprised that political groups or pro-democracy groups are having a difficult time reversing that trend.
Okay, thank you very much, Cameron. I know it's always a pleasure to listen to you, but very quickly, because we promised people, can I just make it 2 minutes, please? Anyone want to ask a question? Because I think we're running out of time. Can you please first give it to you, Dr. Aziz? Can you introduce yourself and ask your question, please?
My name is Aziz Sulaiman. I'm Sudanese. I live in Australia. I believe Sudan is not that important in the American policies, which is what we are following now. The question is, I've got like 5 questions, but I'll try to cut them short. For Mr. Cameron, how come a democratic-led government like US government believe that military in Sudan must be a part or will be a part of a transformation to liberal democracy in Sudan? This is number 1. Number 2 is, you mentioned that revolution, the longer it goes, the stronger it gets. However, Sudanese people are standing alone, facing the brutal killing on the streets. And all we get from US and the West in general is contempt and worries. Last question is, America, in the most cases, they talk the talk and they rarely walk the walk, especially in the third world country, for the third world country, I should say. When is Sudan Democratic Transition Accountability and Physical Transparency Act of 2020 will take place, and what is behind the delay? And ever America going to learn from the mistakes such as Syria and Al-Assad and Russia? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Cameron?
Sure, those are great questions. And maybe I'll just try to answer them as a group, because I think there's a common theme. And I guess the best way to think about how Washington is approaching this is, Washington is afraid of revolutions, which is ironic because the United States was born from a revolution. You would think that we would be more sympathetic to revolutions, especially democratic revolutions around the world. But I think what you see from the State Department is a cautiousness in when faced with revolutions. People want certainty with who to engage with, where the power centers are. And I think by looking for that certainty, what we are doing is reinforcing the status quo. And that's the problem, is as much as we say one thing about wanting democracy and supporting revolution, our actions, because we need someone to talk to, it ends up reinforcing the status quo. What you hear a lot in Washington is not revolution. What you hear is managed transition, which is to say they don't want to see sweeping changes, because when there are sweeping changes, we can't control that. We can't control what's the outcome going to look like. We want to make sure at a minimum that there isn't some kind of Islamist Muslim Brotherhood government that returns to Sudan. And the best way to do that is by having some kind of managed transition, right? They don't want the French Revolution. They want, they want a much more controlled change. And I think that's the tension that exists between not just my government, but other, friends of Sudan, as they're called, and the people of Sudan. I think the people of Sudan are so fed up, they're so frustrated, they're so exhausted from military rule that what they want is a revolution, and they're willing to accept the risks associated with the revolution. They're willing to accept the personal risks of death in the streets, but they're also willing to accept, I think, at the end of this process, if this doesn't succeed, they will at least know that they have tried to have this revolution. And I think Washington is approaching this much differently, which is, again, I said this at the beginning, let's have a process. Let's have an organized process. Let's get people out of the streets. And in an ironic way, the idea of let's get people out of the streets and get them talking around a conference table, that puts Washington, frankly, and the military on the same page. I think the military wants to see the same thing. They want to see the street protests end. They want to see a political process, that they can engage and manipulate. And obviously Washington is wanting not to see the military manipulate the process, but to have some structure and to have some organization. So I do think that that we are just not well placed right now to appreciate what's happening on the ground, and are really trying to organize a process that undermines the revolution. And again, think of this as rather than sweeping the old system away and having a new system, Washington is very much interested in managing that transition, which is why, I hate to keep going back to the CPA, but if you look at the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, that was a managed transition. The CPA was about a new Sudan, right? It was about transforming Sudan into a secular, pluralistic, democratic state. And one of the reasons I think that Washington and others signed on to the CPA with such enthusiasm is because it created this interim period, right? From 2005 to 2011. That gave the international community 6 years to manage this transition so that it wasn't a revolution. It was a managed transition with, a legal document and a process, a very heavy process. That's what the international community wants to see. That's how the international community engages with political change. That's not what the Sudanese people want to see, however.
Okay, Cameron, thank you very much. I know there's so many questions, but I give you one final question because I know the time, we already exceeding our time. There's so many in the last, I don't know, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, many proposal from many different entities or individual or groups about roadmaps for solving the deadlock. Because the deadlock, you talked about it. What is your roadmap for the Sudanese people, which will stop the bloodshed, number one, because we really, the painful scenario now is we're losing them every day. That's number one. There's no trust on the government. You already confirmed the political parties are struggling to gain or regain, maybe at least people engaging with them. But while you're answering this, to close the questions about what is your roadmap based on your experience and all that knowledge of Sudan, but maybe take into account, I don't know, it's just fair to mention some of the question while asking you how can US support the Sudanese revolution in the ground. Saida asking you, how does the US look to the involvement of Israel with the military corps and specifically with the rapid force? Can we remove military leaders from the government without offering them safe exit? So I don't want you to answer all these, but just what is your roadmap? Let's call it Cameron Hudson roadmap for solving this deadlock. Many roadmaps are now being expressed in the media. What can you propose? I think you are I'm biased, like more of us Sudanese, they are offering something. What is your roadmap for solving this deadlock now?
Well, I think that, again, I look at some of the things that the United States can do. I think we have not, I think there needs to be an effort to put pressure on the military, which we have not seen. So targeted sanctions against military leaders. I think we need to remove certain leaders from power. I think that General Burhan has lost the legitimacy and the credibility to be the head of the military and the head of state right now. I think that he needs to leave. I don't care where he goes. I'd like to see him go someplace outside the country, but I think that there is a whole group of generals that need to exit the political scene. I think they want to exit the political scene, some of them. And I think we need to restart these talks with different leadership in the military. That's number one. Those that are sanctioned should not have a role in this or any future political conversation in the country. I think we need to try to separate out the rapid support forces from the SAF and fundamentally divide and weaken that alliance right now. I think we need to, again, I've said this before, support the democratic movement, support the resistance committees, level the playing field, balance the playing field between military and civilian. I think we have to be talking constantly about the fact that any talk of the military being a part of a transition is time limited, and we should put a time limit on that. We should say that, if we agree that the military has to play some kind of role as they exit, then we need to define what that role is. We need to set expectations and say by this day, I think it's very clear. You say you want debt relief. Well, there's a decision on debt relief coming in March that the IMF has to make. Why have we not said, we will not move forward on debt relief in March unless the military divests control of these 10 state companies that it controls. We're not putting those benchmarks out there publicly that will measure their own sincerity, right? We have not said that Burhan should leave or Hemeti should leave. If we do that, I think we're afraid of the answer. I think we're afraid that they're going to say no, and then we're going to be forced into a situation where we have to do something about that. But the fact of the matter is that by engaging in a political process, it only benefits them. It doesn't benefit the Democrats in the room. And so I think that, my roadmap here would be getting very specific about what we expect of the military, what role we think they should play, and what role we think they should play at the end of this process. But also, let's remember, there are things that the military can get from this. The US military can say, in 18 months, if you're out of political office, then you get training, you get equipment, you get, you get assistance. We can also help to professionalize Sudan's military so that, at the end of the day, it is there supporting the Constitution and the state and providing security to the citizens. Now, that takes some faith at this point, that takes a demonstration of sincerity on the part of the military that we haven't seen. But I also think, as much as we need to be punishing those people who have committed abuses right now, we also need to be showing what a future looks like for the military. People are not going to walk themselves to the guillotine, right? People are not going to walk themselves to the Hague or to the Cobra prison. They're not going to walk themselves there voluntarily. And so if we are showing them the Hague and Cobra prison, we also have to show them a way out. We also have to show them what door number 2 looks like for their survival, right? And that choice is theirs, but we haven't made that choice as clear as we need to the military. I think that is the most critical thing that we can do right now.
Cameron, thank you very, very much for your time. I really appreciate it, and I do apologize to many people, but I hope they also give us the excuse. I mean, we took almost 1 hour from your time. Thank you very much, and I hope the next time we will meet face-to-face in Sudan, and you give this talk, or you meet the meeting in the Friendship Hall, like our conference last year. And also, I would like to invite you anytime you're passing by London, please let us know, because I recently joined. This is we have at Queen Mary University a very exciting policy institute, and I know this is your area, called the Global Policy Institute. We have a diverse expert from all over the world. I think if anytime you're coming by London, we will be very delighted to host you. Come and give a talk. Maybe will be more chance for people to have a dialogue with you. Thank you very, very much for your time, and thank you to all those who followed us in the Zoom or outside the Zoom. And I wish you a very happy weekend. Thank you very much for your time. Ma salama.
Thank you. Shukran.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you very much. So we have to stop here, and I think we stop the recording. And Mervin, you okay, Mervin, there?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very, very much for all of you, and we will say goodbye, and we will see you in our next meeting. Thank you very much, all of you. Thank you.
بنحلم بفضاء أوسع، بنحلم بزمن أجمل، بلاد ميلاد، بلاد ميلاد. بنحلم بفضاء أوسع، بنحلم بزمن أجمل، بلاد ميلاد، بلاد ممتد لحد حدود الحد، وطن لا فيه